Senator Claire McCaskill hosts the last of several roundtable discussions aimed at combating rape and sexual assaults on college campuses. This meeting focuses on the differences between the criminal justice system and the university-based process. It's 2 hours, 15 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Since we have a lot of ground to cover and a lot of smart people around this table, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I know that Senator Blumenthal will be joining us, and when he does, I might interrupt whoever is talking at that point and give him a chance to make a few opening remarks when he arrives. First, I want to welcome all of you that are here today. I'm very excited about this particular roundtable because of my background as a sex crimes prosecutor for many years. This is the last in our series of 3 roundtables, which are discussions about sexual violence on college campuses and university campuses. This has been a terrific process and also a very helpful one. On May 19th, we had a really good discussion on the Clary Act and the Campus Save Act. On June 2nd, we had a thought-provoking and intense discussion about the role of Title IX. I wanted to hold these roundtables so that we could bring people together rather than having all of the university officials at one and all of the police at one and all of the victim survivors and advocacy groups at one. I wanted to mix each one so we could get the discussion back and forth, which I think has been really helpful in us finding where really there are points that we can move on in terms of making improvements and changes and holding out best practices to other campuses.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm Detective Carrie Hull from the Ashland, Oregon Police Department. I am an active detective in that agency. My primary caseload is adult sexual assault crimes and then child sexual assault crimes, though we are all general crimes detectives. I also sit on the Legislative and Public Policy Committee for the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force, and am a law enforcement instructor for their training institute, as well as a forensic interviewer of children.
What do you think is preventing strong working relationships between police departments? For those of you that have seen the side of this that is not as good, what is preventing good, strong working relationships between campus police and local police?
Well, I can address some of that. We have a really great relationship with Southern Oregon University that's within our jurisdiction. Now, our department is a little unique, maybe different from some here, where they don't have sworn law enforcement, so our municipal law enforcement would take the case if it was a sexual assault anyway. However, you still have to have that working relationships because oftentimes a victim may present to a campus public safety officer. So you still need all that same training there. We have found that it needs to be an open line of communication for training. Training is incredibly important with a clear understanding, and again, our department is a little bit different. We have what's called the You Have Options program that was developed to increase sexual assault reporting within our city. And then the other side of that program was by increasing reporting, we're increasing intelligence on serial sexual offenders for law enforcement. That absolutely, the foundation of that program is in confidentiality. So that is, with Title IX, we then have to be very cautious about information that we share with the university that would trigger a Title IX investigation. So you'll actually see a flip, maybe, from what you've heard in previous roundtables, and that our municipal law enforcement agency has to be cautious of what we provide to a university. Now, the intent is always still there, though, to share information, to collaborate, because it is much better for the survivor, ultimately, if we want to go forward with anything, to have that collaboration there. But what I would like to enter in for everybody as a starting point is that it's always at the victim's request and with the victim's permission. And we found great success with that happening. And then I also have the unique opportunity to train nationally with different law enforcement agencies and to speak with them very openly about their problems. And there is not typically that collaboration in many that I've spoken with university law enforcement and municipal law enforcement. And again, I think it goes back to a fundamental understanding of what this caseload requires to be successful, and the fact that there's just a general lack of education for law enforcement, be it campus or municipal, in general.
I mean, what my sense is, after all these roundtables, is there is almost a bias in the system away from the criminal justice system. And I understand why the criminal justice system does not have, we've had some, I'm speaking writ large, not me, or hopefully the professionals I worked with when I was doing these cases, but there's some horrible stories about how victims have been treated and the way they've been talked to and the way that their cases have been handled. And that is being used, I think, almost as a cudgel to, in some ways, keep victims from believing that there are people like the people on this panel that will listen and investigate and handle their cases in a very professional and supportive manner, obviously with an eye towards the facts, not an eye towards a certain result. But how do we do this? I mean, how do we, help me here, prosecutors and detective, and help me here, advocates that are worried about victims not having control. Maybe, Carrie, this is where you can talk about you have options.
Yeah, and if I may, I'm dying to answer everything that you said. So, and anybody who knows me here knows. So a lot of what I think you have been hearing, and I am notoriously hard on my own profession, so I'm going to acknowledge that first. But it's because we do not have a great history of doing this caseload, sexual assault, well. And I'm not saying that that's everybody, but let's just address the fact if we were doing these well, we wouldn't be sitting at this table, okay? So I always have a problem with legislating or with putting rules forward for law enforcement with the assumption that they're going to screw it up, because I don't think that solves the problem. And there is a really wonderful trend now, thankfully, among law enforcement where they're starting to acknowledge that this has to be done differently. And the traditional model of policing that works for all these other cases doesn't work in sexual assault because the dynamics are so drastically different. So for instance, when we built this program, this was back in 2009, before any of these conversations were happening. We never intended to be sitting here today. All we wanted to do was make things better in the city of Ashland. But what we did is we went to every victim that was willing to come forward and report to us, and we asked them, if you could change things, what would you do? No restrictions, whatever it was. And I completely agree with you, because every person answered that differently as to what their individual barrier was. So anything that goes forward that's coming from someone assuming what a survivor wants is grossly mistaken. You cannot do that, because what is right for one survivor is not right for another. And for anybody in a profession to assume that they know what the answer to that is egotistical, and it is damaging to this caseload. So what we had to do as law enforcement is we had to get out of our own way. We had to say, tell us how to do this better, because obviously we're not doing it well. My chief, who is extremely forward-thinking, says it best. He says, listen, let's just take the highest statistic of 34%. Right? If we say, and I don't think there's 34% of reporting, but let's just say there was. Even if we were 100% successful in all of those cases, it's still an epic failure. So we had to do something different. And what we said was, let's try everything they asked us to do. And the one thing they asked every single time was for confidentiality. Now,
you know, that is such an important point. And at the end of these roundtables that I held, I came up with a Bill of Rights. For survivors. And one of the rights was to confidentiality.
Yes.
And I think this discussion is extremely valuable, but the other thing we did in the roundtable was we heard from survivors about how this system looks from their perspective.
How do you all handle public record stuff in terms of your model and where the victim gets to decide? Because this is very similar to the military system.
Absolutely.
Restricted and unrestricted reports. So what happens on public record requests to your police agency on a report where a report's been made, but she was wanting to keep it confidential?
Sure. And let me say first, too, that the difference between us and the military model is that we're getting the information to those that are actually doing the investigation. And so that's the goal from the beginning, where it's not going to somebody who is restricted and not doing the investigation. And that's what I do believe. I believe this information needs to go to law enforcement, but with the victim's permission. So specifically to when these reports are released, what we do is, and again, this is a huge break from traditional policing, but we can do this legally, and it may vary different state by state. In Oregon, With public records laws, again, that is when a case has been closed and is no longer being investigated. So we have pretty lengthy statutes of limitations. So what we do is we inactivate it. It doesn't mean that they've told us they never want to do something. They just don't want to right now. And it really solves a lot of problems, because how in the world can you expect a survivor to make a determination about adjudication when something has just happened? I mean, there's no way. Frankly, they wouldn't even have the information necessary to say whether they want to prosecute or not, because we don't have any time corroborating that information. I mean, we don't even know if they have a triable case. So that's never even a conversation that we have. We document everything they'll let us. And what it does is it does help with some of those delays that you're talking about. What I would also say, though, is we can overcome those delays. That's a very traditional policing response, to say, oh, it's a delayed report and therefore it's, unlikely to go forward.
Right.
We actually have shown for years now that's not the case.
Right.
We give much better cases because we're working with a victim the entire time. It's not adversarial. It's not, I need you to do this and you don't have a choice in it. Prosecutors get much better cases. Now, what I would say is when that case is inactivated, we don't have to release it. Of course, could there be a time? Yes. But again, you'd have to have somebody that knows they made the report to come request the report. And I think that's pretty unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. Now, when we get to a public records, typically, is we've already come to a decision with that victim that they want to go forward with what's called a complete investigation. That is a traditional model. It goes to the DA's office, and again, the options are not available at the DA's office because we're not going to tell them how to do their work, but the victim understands that before we make the decision for that to go.
So if it goes to the DA's office and the DA's office decides to nolly it and not take it, then it becomes open?
Yes.
But the decision is by the victim as to whether or not they want it to be a complete investigation with the possibility of referral to the prosecutor.
Yes, absolutely. It's completely with them. We want to keep it inactive and not close it for as long as possible, because we have found time and time again.
They're going to do it again.
Yeah, the way they feel at 6 months, and maybe if we, and again, the other half of the program is we identify serial perpetration, which changes the entire conversation, right? But let's say we don't. We could still get someone coming in 2 years later that says, I'm ready now. And because we did a good job documenting it, we did a good forensic interviewer, we audio recorded it, our prosecutor stands a chance. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's better than it is. And let me, I'm going to say this from a law enforcement perspective, and it's probably not one that you would hear from many law enforcement officers, unfortunately. But what we have learned, and it took us a while to get there, I mean, there was years of fleshing this out, and it still makes us uncomfortable. We're not happy with it because, of course, we want to get to a place where we can arrest serial sexual offenders, because that's what they most are. What we had to realize again was, in order to get there, we needed to understand and fully acknowledge that it is never the victim's responsibility for that arrest. They are never responsible for the offender doing that next offense. The offender is responsible for that next offense, not the victim.
Correct.
And we cannot lose sight of that, because what we hear, and I hear this in all different groups, all different professions, not just law enforcement, I hear it in advocacy too. We will get to a place where it makes us uncomfortable, right? To acknowledge that somebody could know that this happened and we're not doing anything about it. What I think we have to realize is we are doing something about it by allowing a survivor to enter the criminal justice system in the way that's right for them. And so the focus should not be, she didn't come forward and give us everything. The focus should be, we're grateful that she came forward and gave us anything. And that's a very different perspective that changes the entire caseload. You will be successful if you come from that perspective.
So is your reporting up?
Yes, 106%.
Over what period of time?
From 2009 was our 0 year, where we did nothing of this. 2010 to 2013 was a 106% increase.
And to what extent?
But the point is where I find our difficulties is if they're not truly vetted, then they come to us after it was a 5-page paper. That was the sanction, and then now they want us to do something about it. And at that point, we're so hampered that then they say, see, you never take cases anyways, and it's just a perpetuation of the reputation that we're not helping them and that we're not there for them from the beginning. So if there's an Ashland approach where we can collect, I can sit all day long, I can wait a year, 2 years, whatever, until the survivor's ready to move forward and move through the system. Just help me get some of that evidence at the get-go, from the beginning.
So you're saying they're coming to you after they're dissatisfied with the weak result of the administrative process?
Yes.
And if there, I mean, that's the whole reason, right? I mean, this is just the right thing to do, human element of this program, but we're still criminal justice. And so, we say this gives options to survivors, but it also gives information to law enforcement. That it had to be beneficial for both. That's what we discovered. So traditional law enforcement is only beneficial for law enforcement. We go forward in the way that's best for us. And I'm obviously overgeneralizing here, but that is true. It needed to be beneficial for both survivors and law enforcement to be effective. And what I could say is, I mean, I hear the try here to get something from the administrative process that can be helpful for the criminal justice process. And if I could say, the one thing I have seen throughout the years that would make the biggest difference is to have some mandate that anybody who is interviewing a survivor of sexual assault be trained to do so, and for that option to be recorded. So the victim has the option to demand that that is recorded, because I can't tell you how many reports I've been given where somebody did a synopsis of what a survivor said, and it was nothing of what the survivor intended. Right. So if those two things happened, I can take that case and I can corroborate it 5 years later. But I have to have that audio recording of what was actually said by the survivor, by who interviewed them. And those two things could actually make a difference.
And that's your interplay.
I don't know about that. I'd be curious what the advocates or the survivors think about the recording, because I've been in conversations that say that is chilling in itself, that by recording it does put an extra burden, that their testimony is going to be impeached at some future point, or particularly if their recollections change, or if they come out of trauma and they have a whole different perspective on it. I'd just be curious.
But if the interview's done right, then their recollections aren't going to change, because the interview will not ask them to remember things they don't remember, but will rather just ask them to say what they can remember, as opposed to a typical, I mean, as you well know, Chief, there's two different kinds of investigative interviews, and this kind of investigative interview is acknowledging they may not remember everything. And we don't want you to remember things that you don't really remember, because what happens so often is the victim will try to bootstrap their credibility by making up things they don't really remember, because they're so worried whether or not they're going to be believed. And that's the exact opposite of what you really want the victim to do.
And again, if I can address that, we had all these same in the beginning, right? We had all these same ideas, but what we did is we went out and talked to researchers, we consulted with victims, we consulted with victim advocates heavily. They're who built the program. So what we learned was you had victims who traditionally didn't want the recording if it wasn't an option for them. But when you sit down and you tell someone, I'm not going to make you do this, but here's why I want to, because I want to accurately reflect your statements. I don't want to sit down 2 hours later, if I'm lucky, maybe it's 2 days later that I sit down and write my report, and guess as to what you said. And I want to, if you disagree with what my report said, to be able to go back to this and make sure that I'm right. And I also never want someone later to say that you said something you didn't. And I have never, ever in 4 years had someone tell me no. Ever.
But when you gave them the option.
But it's never been pushed on them. I explain why I want to. So, and we have had people say, I'm not ready to do that yet, right? Like, I need some time before that happens. And again, I'm a forensic interviewer. We do this for kids all the time. This has been a model that has been replicated well for children. And I'm not trying to say that adult survivors of sexual assault should be treated like children. However, they should be given the opportunity to talk about what they're able to remember in an environment that is accepting and understanding of trauma. And we do not do a good job of that with law enforcement.
And I think that gets to the bottom line of, I wish that we all lived in Ashland, Oregon sometimes now. I'm moving. But I think that it gets back to training in trauma-informed interviews and in forensic interviews.
I agree, because sex assault does happen without alcohol. And so alcohol is the weapon that perpetrators are using to cause sexual assault. So I think we have to be careful that when we focus on alcohol, it's not about stopping drinking. People shouldn't drink. If you don't drink, you won't be raped, because that's not going to stop sexual assault. We need to be talking about perpetrators who are using alcohol as a way to be able to perpetrate sexual assault. And I think that easily gets confused.
And I would just want to say, too, we thought so much about this specific problem, because we do find that in law enforcement, I've seen some truly awful community presentations about how to, keep safe and women's safety. I mean, that just makes me absolutely cringe. And it's a very slippery slope.
Don't drink and
that
have a buddy, right?
Right.
Well, yeah, cover your, all these things that I think are very well intentioned and extremely ill-informed. And so I'm just going to, I'll read you just a brief part. In the MOU for any agency that wants to participate in the program, we put it in here because we believe so much about it. Caution shall be used when providing any community education regarding risk reduction strategies to avoid shifting the focus from the offender's responsibility to not commit a sexual assault. For example, risk reduction strategies should be framed by how the perpetrator targets a victim, i.e. they're intoxicated or isolated persons, instead of how a victim's behavior allowed an assault to occur, i.e. the victim consumed alcohol. That's a very important clarification to be made if you're going to go down that road. Because we don't, as the professionals in this trying to affect change, need to be perpetuating these myths.
Because those myths get in the way of some people when they investigate the cases. They're like, oh, well, they shouldn't have been drinking or this wouldn't have happened. And that gets in the way of people's investigation, be it police or administrative.
And you do have to understand it, right? If you're going to be a good criminal investigator, you need to understand the vulnerabilities, the accessibilities, and how a perpetrator makes victims appear to lack credibility. And oftentimes all of those are wrapped up in a drug-facilitated or alcohol-facilitated assault. The difference is in showing how they premeditated that, not how the victim allowed it.
Yeah, and the conversation.
For my just final comments, I just want to touch base briefly on the prevention side of it from a different perspective. I do believe that many of the issues that we're talking about today and dealing with do have an enforcement answer to a point. I acknowledge that law enforcement isn't going to be the right answer for everybody. However, when you break from the traditional model of law enforcement and you start providing an environment that encourages reporting and therefore identifying serial perpetrators and providing that information to our DAs to prosecute those offenders, that is a form of prevention. And it will have an impact on our college campuses because we are not only sending a message to victims that they should be heard and what happened to them is important and will be taken seriously, we're sending a message to offenders.
That's right.
That they can no longer keep people silent in the same way they have before. And I do believe if we focus, no matter how you feel about law enforcement, if we focus on fixing some of the issues with our response right now to this, some of these other issues will be affected in a positive way.
I think I love you.
Ditto.
I think all the prosecutors are going, yes, Detective Carrie Hull. And by the way, I think it is, very interesting that you have kind of reworked the traditional law enforcement model. And one of the things I think we need to do is we need to figure out a way to make that model Title IX compliant.
Yes.
And if we could do that, I think we might be onto something that could have a real positive impact on empowering victims and ultimately holding perpetrators accountable, which is, what we want to do. First, empower victims and take care of victims, but second, hold them accountable. And I know right now it's not Title IX compliant. I've already talked to the White House about this challenge, and I think we're going to try to get our heads together and figure out if we can somehow legislate a way to make that particular model Title IX compliant. And it's a little tricky because of the reporting stuff, but I think it might be worth it.
Yeah, well, we have, and I apologize if I said this already, but we have over 40 campus law enforcement agencies sworn that have reached out and said, I want to do the right thing and I want to do this. And we have to tell them right now, you are amazing and that's so great and I'm sorry. So I think it's a positive thing that they're reaching out. It's an unfortunate answer that they can't provide the model.
Well, let's figure out a way that we can make it Title IX compliant, because that's one of those things that technically it's not compliant, but I think what you're doing embraces what we want to see happen within Title IX. So we ought to figure out a way to get that done.
That'd be great.
I think we're in a better